Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Thank you for tuning in today. Welcome to Encounter, a show of the Broome County Council of Churches where we talk about faith and community and current events and all sorts of wonderful things. So I'm so glad you're tuning in with us today. Today I have Dr. Randall, MJ Edouard, and Pastor Maggie Wolford with me. I'm Reverend Alicia Dixon-Gerard, and we're talking about a popular topic during this time, Black History Month, and by extension, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So I'm so glad that you two have joined me. Thank you.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
Oh, yes, Happy New Year.
Absolute pleasure. Happy New Year.
So each of you take about 60 seconds and say a little bit more of what you want to say about yourself as introduction.
All right. Well, hello. Randall Edouard, Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs and Dean of Students at wonderful place, Binghamton University.
I'm a little
Been there for 14 years. I think in March I start my 15th year.
Oh, wow. It's
been an absolute pleasure. Delighted to be here today, particularly speaking on our topic. And just excited to be in the community. I've always been a community-bound person, and just looking forward to the events of today.
Yes.
I'm Maggie Wolford. I'm the student pastor at Central United Methodist Church in Endicott, and also a Master of Divinity student at Drew University down in Madison, New Jersey. So, you and I have been talking about some of this for a while, and I've had quite a journey being born and raised in Kentucky and then now being in New York, and also excited to be talking about this topic.
Thank you. I'm so glad to have both of you. I have to tell you, audience, these two people are brilliant. I've known them not quite that long, but long enough to know that they are just fabulous. So I am so excited about today's show, too. So for those who maybe need a little bit more context, Dr. Randall, can you share a little bit about the history of Black History Month, how it came about?
Woo, that is a long history, a very intriguing history, and a very important history. And I hope I can do it justice, but just from my vantage point and historically thinking about it and the research that I've done over my college years, I know that this was given birth by a great activist, a great educator, a great man in his own right, by the name of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. If I remember the date correctly, in 1926, this was his invention, which began as Negro History Week. And what a lot of folks don't know is that that was given birth by Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who was a Harvard student, a Harvard PhD, by the way. Well, Dr. Woodson was told by his professor that black people didn't have a history.
Yes.
And that's incredible if you think about it in 2023. So that gave Dr. Woodson this passion to say, wait a minute, we do have a history, and we need to talk about this history, and we need to do something. And his something in his brilliance was to begin African American or Black History Black History Week.
It was just a week at first.
It mushroomed to a month as we know it today. And the last thing I will say about that is it was not simply a week to tell about interesting things that black people in America had done at the time, which was critically important, but it was also a call to action. It was also a way to actually educate people on the societal ills and how to mobilize and organize to make things better in the almighty name of social justice.
Yes, yes. Because, of course, one of those key societal ills was the history of slavery, the history of segregation, the history of racism in the country, which had all those things combined tried to eliminate black people throughout the diaspora and black history. And so that needed to be addressed, and this was one brilliant way Dr. Woodson thought of to do it. And it was only a week. We got a month now, but it was only a week.
Absolutely.
Pastor Maggie, tell a little bit more about your background, because we have had interesting conversations about this. And, you know, kind of did you grow up recognizing this month?
In very generic, sweeping ways, yes. Growing up where I did in Western Kentucky, even talking about the Civil War was always also known as the Northern War of Aggression, or also known as the War for States' Rights. There was always this desire to minimize the fact that it was a fight over the rights they were fighting for were the right to keep humans as slaves. And so navigating that when it would come to Black History Month, often it was a lot of talking about the invention of the cotton gin or the creation of peanut butter by Dr. I have just completely forgotten his name. Carter?
I think it's the same guy, Carter.
And yeah,
Carter G. Woodson, right?
Well, no, that was
George Washington
Yes! George Washington Carver.
It's like, it's a very historic name, and I couldn't for the life of me think of it. But it was always sort of these, and very much minimizing anything that was moving society or pushing the boundaries of the academic areas that they worked in, particularly with regard to things like STEM, the arts. It was just, this food was created, this style of music. It was, and even that was always sort of minimized. And so it has been this interesting thing to see how there are so many young people, especially in places like where I grew up, who have no real frame of reference for the true impact of Black Americans on this country,
right,
and the positive contributions and inventions that we use every day that we wouldn't have without those contributions.
Yes, and even those who maybe did not become the inventors, but the everyday working people who, upon whose backs the country is built on. When we think of how slavery, cotton, tobacco, sugar, all the things that are a part of our lives today that we kind of take for granted, were cultivated by enslaved peoples, and so the very foundation of our country has been built on it, built on slavery and the contributions of Black people throughout the diaspora. So to kind of, I think one of the things we can maybe start to do, and it may honor Dr. Woodson and George Washington, Carver Washington, and all these people who have done these amazing things, as well as the everyday people who sacrificed, was to start to think about Black history as American history. Say something about that, either one of you.
Well, for me, Black history is American history, and African history is African history, and history is history. But what's critical for us to know and understand is that knowing what happened, just the truth of what happened is critically important, not just to Black America, it's critically important to America, right? Knowing what happened, and then you all of a sudden are empowered by that history, because what happened is a compelling story. Now there are ups and downs in everything that happens in history, including something I'll say, which will sound weird, and it shouldn't sound weird because it doesn't sound weird when we say Black history, but for like white history. What is that, right? No, we just think of history.
Right.
That's the place we want to get to, right? It's all just history, but there were ups and downs there. But there are things to learn from those experiences, positive, negative, things to learn, and all of a sudden you become empowered to do better and better and better for the future. So I just think it's critical to understand what a role that history plays in human life. I mean, all of life in general. It's absolutely critical, and it has to be part of our general, overall, global curriculum.
And I think your point and emphasis on needing to teach the truth is something that just gets skipped over so often. I mean, we're having all these conversations about critical race theory, but there's also just so many examples of, why can, educators I grew up with just, refer to the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression? Well, because they're going with this skewed history, this apologist, whatever history. And when you're getting to the truth of the Black experience in America, it starts a lot further back than a lot of people realize. I mean, 1619 was the first time that people were sold on this land. And I think many other people would think like, oh, right, like the 17 somethings.
Yes.
And there's also a tendency, I think, to put Black history in just these buckets of there's the experience of slavery, there's the Civil War. Let's sort of skip over Reconstruction and some of the amazing work that was done there, and then for which there was major, backlash and this clamping down, and then the Jim Crow era. But I mean, even history I grew up learning was, and then there was the Civil Rights Movement, and everything's great.
Yes.
Everything was fixed. There's no reason for us to be talking about race and racism. And I don't think you have to look very hard at what's going on in our country and even in this community to know that that is not the case.
Right. So to kind of link what you two are talking about a little bit, and for those who may not know, Reconstruction was that period after the Civil War in which literally the United States had to reconstruct and rebuild itself, and it thought about what would it mean to make the Declaration of Independence true, that all men, eventually women too, are created equal. What would that really mean for African Americans to be considered human and American and people and have that human history story? What would that look like? And there were a lot of strides during Reconstruction to do that, but then there was a backlash, as you was talking about. And for those who may not know what Jim Crow is, it's kind of a nickname of a performer who used to perform in blackface, and it called his character Jim Crow, and it became the symbol of segregation in this country, which the Civil Rights Movement proved inherently treated people of African descent as second-class citizens. And just to be more inclusive, people of Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, and Asian American heritage too, who also helped build this country, the railroads, the Southwest, would not exist without Hispanic folk, Asian and Asian American people. So yeah, there was a pushback post-Civil War, and then the Civil Rights Movement tried to correct that, but there was a backlash even against that too, which is why we're kind of still here. Yeah. So I'm glad that you two are brilliantly, like I told you, they're fabulous, sharing all this wonderful information. And to put Maggie on the spot a little bit, identifying as a white American, what would you say to folks who don't want to celebrate Black History Month? Just recently, I have a friend who's at an organization who said they think that celebrating Black History Month is reverse racism. So they do not want to celebrate it. She is their leader and has said we should, and they pretty much have said, well, we're not, and are kind of trying to overrule her, as their leader. What would you say to that?
I think a lot about the people who I think are saying things like, well, all lives matter and we shouldn't celebrate Black History Month. And these different things. They're also the same people who often say things like, why does everything have to be about race? Why are we talking about this? Things didn't used to be so polarized and politicized and whatever. And to all of them, I would say, look at the civil rights movement. There were very intentional and difficult choices made as part of that movement to get people's attention. I think a lot about having done graduate education in communications and mass media, thinking about how if that had happened 30 years before, where things were only being reported on radio and not television, would it have mobilized people in the same way? And I feel very strongly, as an individual, but also as a faith leader, that is what we need to be doing now as well. I think that there is a call to be involved, not just to, oh, God loves all people. It's like, God does love all people, but also there are particular communities that are being actively harmed,
right,
or that are still experiencing generational effects of racism and segregation, and so there needs to be an active component. So for anyone who says we don't need this, beg to differ. Tell me, if that person can tell me almost anything about Black history, I would be surprised.
Oh, that's a challenge. She just dropped the mic and laid down the gauntlet on that one. I love it, though. I love it. For those of you just tuning in, we are Encounter, a TV program and radio program of the Broome County Council of Churches, and I have Dr. Randall Edouard with me and Pastor Maggie Wolford. We're talking about Black History Month and a little bit by extension Martin Luther King Day. So hopefully you have just tuned in, or you've been tuned in and you're enjoying the conversation. And I'll turn a little bit to Martin Luther King Day and Black History Month as institutions now. There are some people of color who argue a little bit that about maybe that harms us because it can become tokenism in a way. We've done our duty. We educated you about who invented traffic light and peanut butter and all that stuff. We're good. Go make a sandwich and let's not talk about it anymore. Dr. Randall, weigh in on that. Do you think that it causes more harm than good, or what do you think?
I absolutely, without compromise, do not think that it causes any harm, any harm whatsoever. And I would argue that just history in general, American history, is plastered all over the place, everywhere you walk, everywhere you turn. You turn on the television, everywhere, and it hasn't harmed America. So why would that understanding its own history, because that's what Black history is, why would that harm America? And I venture to say, I argue, I would love to do a little experiment, because people need to understand that when Carter G. Woodson came out with Black History Week, he was doing that in direct challenge to the curriculum that was in place that unfortunately degraded the history or the existence of Black people and people of color. So our young people still do not know this history. And I would love to do that experiment where I would just name names and ask some middle school Black folks and some middle school white folks if they recognize these names. And I would throw out names like David Walker. I would throw out names like Nat Turner. I would throw out names like Henry Highland Garnett. I would throw out those kinds of names, and I'm pretty sure that those young Black students wouldn't know those names. Then I would throw out the names of Thomas Jefferson. right? I'll throw out the names of Abraham Lincoln. I'll throw out those wonderful names you need to know.
Yes.
Right? George Mason. I want to throw those names out. See if they recognize those names. And we will find in that small experiment that not only the white middle schoolers know those names, but the black middle schoolers know those names as well.
Right.
And the question needs to be, well, it's all our history. Why don't they know those other names?
Yes.
And that's why we need in 2023 to continue in this journey in teaching the history of America.
Yes.
And now we're calling it Black History Month. I'm waiting for it to become Black History Year.
I love that. For obvious reasons, folks. But yes, I love that. And you're absolutely right. Every now and then, I'll be, working on a sermon or something, and these little quizzes pop up that try to trap you. See how high your IQ is. I don't know if you've ever had those pop up on your screen. And I'm a sucker. I oftentimes fall for them. And one was, can you recognize these people? And they all were white. It was like Bach and Napoleon and Jefferson and George Washington and all those sort of people. And I thought, where are the people of color? Where are the people of color? Now, I know the names you were naming because I was a history major first before I started studying theology. So I can cheat. I remember a little bit of that stuff. But I think you're absolutely right that is missing the understanding among most young people today and even adults of how much people of color have contributed to our history. And not just the inventions and the science, but when you think about someone who is controversial like Nat Turner, he was pushing for the abolition of slavery. And I think a lot of Americans today pride themselves on feeling like we're a democracy, that we're a country of equality, supposedly. This was a man who was fighting for that. So you should know about him, as was David Walker.
Oh, yes.
You should know about that. So yes, you make a very valid point. I like that. I like that argument.
I think it's interesting too, as much as I would love to think that every middle schooler is just memorizing their textbooks, there's also something to be said for the stories we tell. I mean, looking at the media in terms of films and books and, all of these things. And so it's been lovely to see some stories being put forward that hadn't before, but there are still not enough. I mean, how many Abe Lincoln movies are there? How many, and there's just all these stories about American history that focus on individual people and the things that they overcame or, supposedly overcame or whatever, but then really the majority of stories that are told about people of color are either major civil rights leaders or sort of one-offs. We get a lot of things about Martin Luther King Jr., we get a lot of things about Harriet Tubman, for example, but then we don't get a lot about some of the other incredible leaders. And I mean, the Octavia Spencer did that mini-series of the first female billionaire who had a mansion near Rockefeller, and that's a story I had never heard. That's not history I knew growing up, and that's incredible.
And then the everyday people behind those leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't march alone.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Harriet Tubman didn't run the whole Underground Railroad by herself. So there's everyday, ordinary people who were behind that, who again are fighting for ideals that we pride ourselves on of as Americans: freedom, democracy, equality. These things that don't exist for every people group in our country yet.
And something that folks don't understand also is the beauty of the history, the truth of the history. And in that existence is that it was a multiracial coalition that led to freedom in America for people of color, African American people. So, and I am a big proponent of multiracial coalition because what's America? That's America.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
So, and our students, they need to learn this, and that's why history is so critical.
Yes.
But going back to your point from earlier, it is also, I think, very critical that history be true. And, thinking about some of the narratives that do exist, there's a ton of white savior narratives. These films like The Help and others that are sort of notorious for that. But there's also, in a lot of these stories, there is a framing device that allows white watchers to not to see themselves in the racists or those actively causing harm, but to see themselves in, the people who are also helping to fight for liberation. And I think that it is important that people know, racism doesn't only exist in the South.
Right.
And, there's major inequalities around the country and throughout history. And until we acknowledge that and recognize that, we're not going to be able to move forward, because there will be people who say, we don't need to learn about this.
Right. So truthful history of understanding that sometimes you aren't the good protagonist in those movies as a white American, you might be the bad protagonist, but that there is room for transformation to participate in a multiracial movement toward freedom. That that can be you, and that can be part of your white history, and kind of becoming a good white ancestor versus the narratives of white saviorism that white people are superior and have to rescue people of color from their own doom, so to speak. So I'm going to let you go ahead and talk quickly about these books in our last minute here.
Yeah, well, I say history is so critical because I sincerely believe that understanding and learning my history saved my life. I'm from New York City, inner city in South Jamaica, Queens. Grew up really in difficult times. My mom passed away early on. I was surrounded by crime and drugs and danger. And I tell you, these two books that I'm holding in my hand.
Say the title out loud for those on the radio.
One is entitled There is a River, written by Dr. Vincent Harding, the Black Struggle for Freedom in America. And the other is The Slave Community, written by John Blassingame. These were two notable historians writing about the truth about history in America. I read these books and I said, this was my question to myself, how did Black people even survive?
And those books
that empowered me. I said, we can do anything. After I read this, we could, if we're still on this planet after what we went through, we're still on this planet. And I could sit here as Dr. Edouard, we can do anything.
We can do anything. Thank you for joining us. You've been listening to Encounter, a program of the Council of Churches in Broome County.